Good morning and welcome. Welcome to our friends from St. Albans. We're glad you're joining us this morning, and welcome to our speakers today. Thank you so much. I'm here just to welcome you and to introduce our speakers, and I'm so glad that we have this time together, and thank you for being here. So today we welcome Margaret Rawls and Canon Leonard Hamlin from the Cathedral, as well as Katie Cristol, the Arlington Board Chair. Welcome, and thanks for being here.
I'm grateful for the welcome. Let me say good morning to everybody. Hopefully you're as excited to be here in this gathering as I am excited to be here with you. We've been looking forward to meeting with all the different grade levels and students from both schools so that we could talk about one of the great really activities and events as well as efforts that we have taking place over at the Cathedral. For us to come down, come over, come across in all of these different ways to get together is important because we're all in this together. As mentioned, I'm Leonard Hamlin, Canon Missioner of the Cathedral, and I get a chance to lead our social justice work. I get a chance to lead our outreach and connections with everyone. But on this day, we get to talk about this special project, as you see, is being lifted on this morning. There is an effort over at the Cathedral called The Light in the Darkness, the Racial Justice Windows Project at the Washington National Cathedral. There were some windows that were in the cathedral that were and have been referred to as the Confederate windows or the Lee Jackson windows. And so today, as we talk about what is going on through this project and around our community, we get a chance to talk about the Confederate memorials and the Lee Jackson windows, as well as hear from our guest this morning, who will speak about a neighboring community that some of you are very familiar with, Arlington County, and the Arlington County House, where, of course, General Lee used to live over in Arlington Cemetery. And so we're going to lift for you this morning why this matters. So we're grateful to have Margaret Rawls, who works over at the Cathedral and leads, of course, our institutional projects, as well as Katie Cristol, who is Arlington County Board Chair. They're going to come before you today and talk with you, and then we'll take questions.
Hello. How are you all? Good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lee Jackson windows. Did anyone here already know about the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson windows at the Cathedral? Maybe a couple people? So as Canon Hamlin mentioned, there were two windows at the Cathedral, smaller windows on the south side, so the St. Albans side of the building, dedicated to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And if we want to talk about the windows, we want to talk about them in context, because they're more than just the windows here at the Cathedral. So if I were to ask you, when do you think the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson windows were installed? Does anyone want to take a guess? Right over here. 2009. A little before that. Anyone else? In the orange. 1960s. Really close. One more guess. Anyone? 1945. Right in between 1945 and 1960. The Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson windows were installed in 1953. So you could ask yourself, why would you install windows to Civil War generals 100 years after the end of the Civil War? That seems kind of silly. So the Lee and Jackson windows exist in a larger context of memorializing the Confederacy in the South post-Civil War. I know you all have learned about the Civil War, you've learned a little bit about Reconstruction, and you've probably heard around about these Confederate monuments. You've seen the big Lee statue in Richmond that was taken down, you've seen some of the statues here in DC, and you may wonder, okay, why do we have them? Like, what's the deal with Confederate monuments? Why would you put up statues and memorials and schools and buildings and windows to the losers of a war? So the windows exist within a larger context of the memorialization efforts after the end of the Civil War. A lot of these windows were put up, these statues, these memorials, were put up by civic groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and other memorial groups. They were groups whose purpose was to tell the story of a lost cause, of a South that didn't lose a war, but was a glorious thing that could be remembered. Because history is about the stories we tell. And these groups and the people that put up these statues chose to tell a story that wasn't necessarily the full history. They wanted to tell a story and change the landscape that told a history that was one-sided, that talked about a war and an experience that wasn't inclusive of the entire country or the nation, and instead framed the Civil War as something that wasn't a bad thing, that was to be re-remembered. So they put up memorials, they put up statues, they put up windows, and ways these windows and memorials work in public parks and cities is that they change the landscape. Memorials go out. If you think about it, when you go to the National Mall, you all have been down there, right? Right? You see Lincoln and the Washington Monument and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and they tell these stories about our country. They're stories that you all know, they're stories, they're history that you remember, and that's what these same kind of memorials to people like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson did. Except we know that they aren't necessarily the full story. So the Lee and Jackson windows exist in this context. They exist within this larger idea of how we want to tell a story about the Civil War, a story that we now know isn't full. But in the 1930s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy come to the cathedral and say, we'd like to think about ways to remember Robert E. Lee. You know, the cathedrals in general tell stories, all the way from the West Rose window, that big one at the back of the building that tells the story of creation, all the way to the altar, which tells the story of creation and salvation. Cathedrals tell stories, and cathedrals, especially Washington National Cathedral, tells a story of the nation. You've all been there, you've seen Washington and Lincoln and the space window. It tells the stories you want to remember. And in the 30s, there was this discussion about what story we wanted to remember with Robert E. Lee. Discussions began then in the 30s, and they continue for about 20 years afterwards. And the idea, we can say now, we know looking back, really what were they thinking, but that they wanted to tell this story of Robert E. Lee as a good Christian man. And this is a story that was inherited for generations. You have parents thinking it and grandparents thinking it. And we now know that that's not the full story. But at the time, the idea was that you could put a window to Robert E. Lee, and that they had actually thought about putting a window to Ulysses S. Grant. And it could be an idea to bring the country together. In the end, after much discussion, they dedicated windows to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in 1953. The Grant idea was taken off the table because they decided that was too divisive, and they put these two windows up. And the windows remained largely undisturbed for about 60 years. Except that's not quite the case, because of course there were always people that went into that building and knew that there were windows to Confederate generals, and it wasn't a place for them. They knew that that meant that there was a story told in the building that wasn't inclusive of their experience. But in 2015, following the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church, Charleston, South Carolina, the then dean called for the removal of the windows. He gets up at the Canterbury pulpit and says, we need to reckon with our history, and we need to remove these windows. And what started was a 2-year process of examining what kind of stories we want to tell in the building. In 2016, they decided that the windows needed to stay for 2 more years so we could have some conversation. So we could use them as a catalyst to have these difficult conversations, to think about race in America, to think about the stories we tell, to think about how we memorialize and remember things. But at that time, the cathedral decided that the Confederate battle flags couldn't stay. The Confederate battle flags were used as a symbol for racism, for white supremacy, and they were too charged. So conversations start. We start working with our community members, we start talking to the larger community, we have programs, events. But in 2017, following the Deadly Unite the Right rally, the cathedral decides to remove the windows. We declare that there's an impediment to worship. You can't have windows that make it so that not everyone is welcome in the cathedral. You can't have iconography, sacred art, that is an inhibitor to our mission to be a house of prayer for all people. So the windows are removed in 2017, and we spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, what does this mean? If we're going to remove windows, that's one thing, but you can't actually continue the conversation without doing something else. So programs, more talks, more work with the community happens, and in 2020, during the pandemic, we come back together and say, okay, this is really exciting. Let's put new windows in the building. It's not every day you get to put new iconography in a cathedral. And a task force comes together to think about, what do we want to remember? What is it that we want these new windows to say? Because windows tell stories. And we want these windows to tell a fuller, more inclusive story. In 2020, the cathedral announced that acclaimed artist Kerry James Marshall would be designing the new windows. Kerry James Marshall is an African-American artist and arguably one of the best modern artists in the country at this point. He'll be designing new windows that tell a fuller, richer story about the experience of America. And that's really exciting. We're really eager and excited to have a new space in the cathedral that allows us to have these hard conversations, to think about what stories we want to tell, and to think about what stories we want to keep telling. So we're in the process of building the windows right now. If you all have been to the cathedral recently, you've probably seen the exhibit that's there. And if you haven't, when you're walking around at some point in the next couple of weeks or months, I encourage you to go look at it. You can see that there's scaffolding up, there's some information about the old windows, there's some pictures, and we're getting ready to put in the new windows next fall. So the idea is that we'll have new windows and a new bay in the fall of 2023 to talk about the stories we want to tell. So the cathedral's experience isn't unique. There are lots of other places around the city and the country that are also dealing with these things. I'm going to invite Katie Cristol up. She's going to talk about Arlington County and what they've done there.
Good morning. This is Arlington House, formerly known as the Robert E. Lee Memorial on the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. That is the former logo of Arlington County. It's a stylized version of the Robert E. Lee House. It is, of course, where Arlington County gets its name, Arlington House, but it is evocative of a symbol of Robert E. Lee. It is evocative of what is quite literally a plantation, a place of enslavement and atrocity. Shortly after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, as our county and Arlington, as so many across the United States, began engaging in difficult conversations with not just the legacy of systemic racism, but the way in which systemic racism was actively being perpetuated and continuing to shape our daily life in Arlington County, activists coalesced around the idea that that logo was a symbol that linked Arlington to a racist and oppressive past. It wasn't a symbol that, as Margaret talked about, was inclusive of all. It wasn't a symbol that invited everyone to feel welcome when they saw it on the edge of a county community center or even the side of a snowplow. Our NAACP, among others, called on us to think about a new logo and a new identity for Arlington County. So we opened a public process. We took in more than 400 design submissions from across Arlington, took 29,000 votes, asking people to participate through billboards and signs and QR codes all across the county. We had a logo panel that weighed in. This is the final version that we chose. It's designed to evoke Arlington's close relationship with the district as well as our neighbor in Alexandria. That stylized border in the center echoes the Potomac River border on our east. This is one story. But as the writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has described, that there is danger in a single story. In fact, the consequence of the single story is that it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. This is a simple narrative of how we went from where we were to where we are, but it is complicated by the many perspectives shared within our community. Just yesterday, actually, I was at an historic designation for a cemetery in one of Arlington's oldest Black churches, and I ran into the president of the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington, who brought up, unprompted and unaware that I was coming to speak to you all today, that business with the logo change. And Scott talked about this disapprovingly. From his perspectives, in some ways, Arlington House represented, yes, enslavement, but also the extraordinary craftsmanship of the Black men and women who built that beautiful historic home. He said, to his mind, when people think about Black labor, Black enslaved labor, they think about toil in the fields. They don't think about the gifts of architecture and craftsmanship that are part of the legacy because of the incredible achievement of Black enslaved people, even during times of such brutality. He had thoughts that were less positive about the fact that Arlington County has changed the logo. The truth is, we contain multitudes as a community. We have had some very difficult conversations along the way about what symbols represent us, but more importantly, what acts represent us. And so the bottom line for me is that this may be the new logo of Arlington County, but the new symbols of Arlington County have to be the work that we're doing to redress systemic racism. We are a community that was founded in the shadow of slavery. We are a community that for too long honored slavery. We are a community that has been stamped by the legacy of not only slavery, but institutional oppression, Jim Crow, and exclusion. And so in some ways, I think about the new symbols of Arlington County being, for example, a community oversight board to bring community review into policing and criminal justice. I think about the new symbols of Arlington County being an incredibly difficult conversation our community is having right now about single-family zoning and its relationship to historic exclusion in housing and who could live where. I think about the new symbol of Arlington County being these difficult conversations and real change to make sure that we're not just living out the legacy of slavery, of exclusion, of systemic racism, but actively creating an anti-racist future that can be different from that past. The last thing I'll leave you with is a couple of other areas, because these symbols run deep throughout our communities. I suspect no matter where you all call home, whether it's the district, Maryland, Virginia, somewhere else entirely, your community has these legacies too. And so we in Arlington County are, again, in the shadow of Arlington National Cemetery, but the Robert E. Lee Memorial is a federal monument. So I will note that both our congressman and senator in Virginia, Don Beyer, and Tim Kaine have introduced a joint resolution to rename the Robert E. Lee Memorial to simply Arlington House, not to whitewash or wash away the history of Robert E. Lee, but to say what we are lifting up is the full story of Arlington House, including the rich history of those who were enslaved there, not simply memorializing and certainly not honoring someone who took up arms against the United States and enslaved fellow Americans. And so that effort is underway in Congress. We also have had for many years, one of the major corridors in Arlington was Lee Highway. And the community of residents and business owners along Lee Highway came together to argue for the renaming of Lee Highway. It took partnership from the Virginia General Assembly to get Arlington the authority to rename Lee Highway within our borders. But with the help of one of our excellent delegates, Rip Sullivan, we were able to get that authority, and the community worked for many months to reimagine what they wanted Lee Highway to become. And the answer was Langston Boulevard, named after John M. Langston, who is now memorialized in a beautiful piece of public art, a mural painted by a Black DC artist, who was a statesman, the first Black congressman, a founder of an historically Black college right outside of Richmond, and in many ways the embodiment of what we hope our foot forward will be in Arlington, a legacy of scholarship and empowerment. And so now we invite you to participate in one of our great programs, or have a spectacular meal at District Taco, or visit a friend on Langston Boulevard as well. So I will end there, but to say that I resonate with, and I am so excited for, this community, the broader National Cathedral community, as you engage, not just, as Margaret said, in taking down or stepping back from those legacies or symbols of oppression or slavery, but meaningfully re-envisioning what it looks like in the beautiful form of new windows to be a place that is truly inclusive. The voices of young people in Arlington have been integral to all of this work. We had students weigh in on the votes for the names of the new Langston Boulevard. We had students submit ideas for our new logos. This is your future, and so I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you all, to see you all, and to learn about the role that you will play in envisioning a future symbol of what the National Cathedral community can become.
Certainly, as you all have listened, you've heard really them share about how we're telling stories, and stories matter. If I were to ask many of you to imagine what the future would look like, all of you would tell me a story. But the question would be, in telling that story, who's in the story and who gets left out of the story? If you started to make up the story and to talk right now about what you imagine tomorrow is going to look like, and we're here because tomorrow is really dependent upon you all who are sitting here right now. Tomorrow is really dependent upon what you will imagine, what you will do. Even as we're dealing with that today, and you deal with it on a daily basis, how you treat each other, how you invite others into conversation or leave others out of conversation, how there's groups and some feel as if they belong and others feel that they do not belong. We're here because it's part of the history that we've all wrestled with. It's seen in the windows. It's seen in the government. Many of you right now, you get these two areas that you come to. You get to go to chapel and you deal with faith. You get to go to history class and you deal with government. Well, in the cathedral, as you've heard, there are two great stories that we try to tell. One is a national story of how we have grown together and have wrestled with being united together, to be one group working together for the betterment of all. Out of one many, as it says, or out of many one. And as we look at this on today, even in our coming, we're wrestling with this and we're hoping for a brighter and a better future. So we tell these two stories, the faith story, and it combines when we talk about our faith, and you sit in chapel, that when we look at our faith, we're talking about our aspirations even. Who do we want to be? And before you even start asking questions, I want you to think this morning about who you want us to be. You can look at stories all over. I just listened to, and many of you, anybody in here Marvel comic fans? Anybody here like the Avengers or the Wakanda movies and all that's coming out? I'm one. But I heard a story recently, and I heard a story just not too long ago, is that when the Avengers first came out and they first had that, they realized that they brought, of course, as we know, the actor Chadwick Boseman, who played, of course, King T'Challa, who, of course, passed away. He was really only brought onto that movie to do a cameo, a small bit in the original piece. And then everybody started asking the question, how did we leave him out? He needs to be part of this full story. From there, a whole movie and movies have come about, all because they realized somebody was left out. When we look at the windows and the effort that we have at the cathedral right now, there's an effort not just to remove the windows, but how do we tell a full story? That every time you visit the cathedral, and you get a chance to visit the cathedral regularly, coming over, you walk through, I hope that you will pay attention to the windows, because the windows tell stories. Unlike the clear windows that are here, maybe some of the windows that look in stained glass and pictures in the rear of there, pay attention to the windows, because in churches, in faith communities, you'll see pictures of characters and historical characters. You'll see biblical characters. You'll see those who have impacted our lives. Before people could read, stained glass windows were used as a way to tell stories. And so before you could read it in a book, people were able to see who those people were. And even then, when you look at windows, who's in the windows and who's in the story and who's not in the story is important. And we're trying to tell a richer story, not by taking things out, but by making sure that there's enough representation to tell the story all the way through. As we look in this, all I have to do is press the button, Margaret. You can see. That's right, telling the right story. I'm just grateful that I can hit the right button on some days. As you can see, telling the richest story, there's a picture here that shows really a part of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. When we took the windows out, we gave the windows, and not gave completely, but we lent the windows to the museum so that they could show the windows in a full context about what was going on through Reconstruction, that period of time, of course, where symbols were put up, and symbols matter. Symbols matter. There's a lot of symbols that I see already. I see pins that are on. I see some things that probably are resting on sweaters. I see already that whether it's manufacturers, symbols matter because they make us think. Symbols matter because they tell part of the story. And when we look at all of these symbols, we've got to look at the symbols that we are creating so that we can tell a full story. The windows were sent to be part of a display and an exhibit down at the museum. We have worked together with the museum so that they could take advantage of both the effort and stories that they are trying to tell, that we are taking advantage of the stories that we are trying to tell, and by our relationship with each other, both of us are telling the story as rich as we can. As you start to think about what the future will be, and I hope that you are right now, because all of you can make a difference right now. All of you can make a difference in this moment, not later, but today. I hope that you will think about the symbols that you are creating, that you're using, the stories that you're telling, the company that you're keeping, the way that you're working with one another, the friends that you have, and the friends that you should be making. Because you all play a great role, not just in what takes place here within NCS, here what takes place at STA, but you all play a great role in everything that goes on this campus. You all play a great role on everything that gets done in this community. You all play a great role when you leave here of what you will do in your homes, your families, your neighbors. And we're here this morning to remind you that through these efforts and encourage you through these efforts to do what you can do in this moment, to pay attention to the history, to look at the present, but imagine what the future is going to look like. To imagine right now how you can help us all be the best that we can be. Every time you go to chapel, that you're thinking about the best that you can be, how you treat your neighbor, how you're serving those who are strangers yet to become friends. When you're in class, you're doing your best, learning as much as possible to be the best that you can be. Where that will come up later in life, how you'll use that later in life. These are the moments that matter. And so as we get a chance just for this short bit of time to stir your thoughts and give you room to ask questions, what I really hope and we hope is that we're stirring your imagination to what we can be, the best that NCS can be, the best that STA can be, the best that the Cathedral Close can be, the best that this world can be. And everybody in here plays a great part. Everybody in here can contribute something. You may not contribute the same thing, but everybody in this room is part of the story. Doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter your background, doesn't matter the color of our skin. We are all children of our Creator. And by that, it means that everybody is important. And so we hope that in leaving here today, you will imagine how great we can be by seeing the possibilities and where we are, and take actions that some will question, but it's in the principles that we live our lives with, that we love our neighbors as ourselves. So thank you all today. We want to leave some time for questions today. And so if you ask questions, I'm going to ask Margaret to take questions. She's good at pointing them out. And we'll try to answer the questions on history, government, faith, how we've gotten here, what you're dealing with in your community if there's questions.
If you want to raise your hand if you have a question, we can get going. Any questions? About the windows, Arlington County, stories. Yes?
I'm an Arlington resident, and I'm pleased with what you've done so far, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about the high school that's changed its name as well, and any other things that might be in place.
That's a great question. I'm going to come back to the microphone. Thank you so much for asking. A little recovering from being under the weather. So the question, if anybody didn't hear it, was about, yep. The question, if anybody didn't catch it, was about the renaming of one of Arlington's 3 high schools, which was historically Washington Lee High School, has now been renamed as Washington Liberty. Great question. So that was one of the major conversations our colleagues on the school board had with the school community, but of course, the school and county work really closely in terms of government and in terms of our daily life in Arlington. You know, that was not without controversy, and I think what was interesting about that renaming process was in some ways the generational divide. So I know there were some current students that liked the old name, and there were some alumni that supported a new name change. But on balance, a lot of the advocacy for the name change came from the current generation of students, and a lot of the advocacy to keep the name as it was came from the alumni or the older generations. And what I would say that conversation came down to was this idea, again, as Margaret talked about, as Reverend Hammond talked about, who is welcome at our schools. And I think that matters so much for you all as young people and students especially, right? The symbols that you see, the names that you are wearing on your jerseys when you compete says something about who's valued in our community. And to have, you know, the leader of the Confederacy, and Margaret talked about this a little bit, but it's so important to know that this Robert E. Lee is someone who is famed for taking up arms against the United States to defend the institution of slavery, right? Whatever the history may be of Robert E. Lee and his impact on Virginia or our region, it is inarguable that that is his major legacy. And so what does that mean? Washington Liberty is an incredibly diverse school, dozens of different languages spoken, people from all backgrounds. What does it mean for such a diverse school to stand in that shadow? So they made the decision to change the name to Washington Liberty. They too went through a process and considered quite a few different names. One of the more creative was that, speaking of comics, somebody argued that they should keep the name Lee but make it for Stan Lee instead of Robert E. Lee, the great comic book pioneer. But they ultimately chose Liberty instead of renaming it for another individual, the idea of naming it for a value that we all share, and certainly George Washington fought for the other half of that name. So thanks for asking. That's definitely one of the big areas of our community's conversation as well that really involved a lot of students too.
Any questions? Maybe about what were in the windows? Oh, right over here, the white and red sweatshirt. Can you say that a little? What is the new window going to be? That's a great question. The new window, so we haven't unveiled the design yet. We haven't seen all of it. But the new window is going to tell a story about the light and darkness and the full experience of the American people. That's a pretty broad theme, right? Like everyone here could come up with probably 20 different ideas about what that window is going to look like. But the window, it was important. So we don't know exactly what the window is going to look like. You'll have to keep your eyes peeled and see what it looks like when it is unveiled in a year. But the important part is that the window is going to show a history about the African American struggle and the struggle for racial justice and the struggle for freedom and equality for all in America.
If I could add to that, because a great question about the windows and what they would look like. The committee that had been working, of course, to bring us to this point and having conversations, one of the charges that was given to the artists was to be able to really tell a story that at the same time would propel us forward and to imagine where we're going. So when you start looking at how do you tell a story? How do you tell a story about the past, but at the same time, look into the future or move us into the future. There's a wonderful question when you talk about art or history and other pieces. Can talking about our past propel us forward at the same time? It's a tough thing to do, but the artist is working on that right now. So even as you tell your stories and you wrestle with history, never leave out where we're going and where you would like to see us go in every moment. And so he's doing a wonderful job, and I think that you'll see that when it comes up.
I think I saw a hand over here. Right. So the question was, I had mentioned that there was an idea to put a window with the Lee window to Ulysses S. Grant. And he asked a very good question, how is that a more divisive issue than putting up two Confederate generals? That's a really good question. And that's a hard question, too. So the women that funded the window, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, are the ones that funded much of the memorial landscape around Confederate monuments. And their primary goal, what Katie talked about too with the Robert E. Lee Memorial, was to tell a story that lauded Confederate ideology and Confederate ideas. So a group that took up arms against the United States ostensibly and to protect slavery, they wanted to tell a story that gave them power and gave them authority. And if you put Lee with Grant, that doesn't tell the same story. That doesn't tell a story of good Christian men, that they wanted seen in the windows. It tells a story that is more two-sided, that takes us forward, that makes us think about why you would have these things. And so the idea was ultimately scrapped because it didn't give the authority that that iconography and that symbolism was that they wanted to put forward. I'm looking at Leonard to see if he wants to.
No, certainly. When you talk about how that would be divisive, like Margaret said, we really don't know the full thoughts of everyone at that time. But the difficulty that we have, and that I can only imagine from that moment, is that they had a hard time imagining how they could sit down and have a conversation. That one side saw it one way, another side saw it another way. And they could not find a way to talk about these values, the wrestles, what drove us even into war. And we're still struggling with that today. In many areas, you can see it in the news. Many of you are reading that, you're looking at that, you hear it in conversations. You're probably talking to each other about it when you look at these divisions in government and communities and others. And part of it is because we have a difficulty in sitting down, just having conversations with each other. And so even at where you all are right now, when differences come up, I don't expect you to answer this right now, but when differences come up, how do you all go about solving your issues? You have those who are around you right now, whether they're teachers, staff, faculty, administration. They're here to help with that. And I hope that you're taking advantage of that. They're giving you ideas on that so that we don't end up in the same place where we were in history. Not being able to solve our issues, not being able to talk to each other, not being able to be, as we said, a real, I'll use the vernacular to say, a full team, even in some cases. That we're working together as one unit. So, I mean, it's a great question to ask. How come they saw, even in the windows of putting the two sides together, if it meant bringing together, was that seen as divisive? They couldn't even sit down and talk about it in a very good way. And it ended up there. So it's not a problem of the past. It's still a problem of the present. And we still have to work on it at every level. adults, youth, at every level, organizations, of how we're talking to each other. And I hope that even as there may be thoughts in these rooms, and you think about, we were all in school at time, this group over here, that group over there, the challenge that you all have is how do you solve your issues today? How do you solve them and get on the same page? How do you treat those who are different than you are, however that gets defined? But knowing that differences don't mean less, differences can mean more when we bring them together in the right way. Other questions?
I have a question about the logo change. Was that like a tough process, or did it come more like unanimous?
Great question about the process of Great question about the process of the logo change. It was really hard. So I've been in government, been on the county board for almost 8 years, and we've taken up a lot of controversial issues over time. This one got so much attention, and I think it's because everybody can have an opinion on a logo, and people know what they like and what they don't like. And so I mentioned that we had 400 submissions. We started out with about 250 submissions, came up with some finalists, took those to the community, and overwhelmingly heard that people didn't like any of them. So we had to go back out to the community. We got more, my colleagues and I tried to do a lot of listening. One of the things we try to do a lot of in Arlington is bring divergent perspectives together, actually just like Reverend Allen was talking about. So we had a working group that brought together, people who cared a lot about the old logo, for example, the chair of our NAACP, as well as branding experts and people who had some marketing background, staff from economic development. We brought in an outside consultant to take a look too. We had to do a copyright check to make sure that none of the finalists, didn't look too similar to the logo for Pepsi or something like that. So it was a surprising undertaking in terms of getting to that new logo. And it wasn't easy, but I think it was important to the community. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. I'm going to see if I can't go back to the slide. All right. There it is. Okay. And then, there we go. Great question. So, I'll be honest. My favorite was also actually the one in the bottom right corner. But we tried to be really democratic about it. So we cared both about the input from the logo community and then the votes. So I mentioned people were scanning QR codes. If you came to the county fair, there'd be a sign up about how to weigh in. And the one that won was a combination of the recommendation of our committee and the highest number of votes. So kind of an interesting lesson about government there. Sometimes we try to be representative. We take in a lot of information and try to represent the best of the community. Sometimes we try to do things purely democratically. This was one where I was like, okay, this is simple enough and people have strong enough opinions. I'm going to bow to the whims of democracy here, even though I like that more colorful one in the corner. Yeah?
So you were talking about how, it's important to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Yeah.
Which, of course, springs to mind the saying, those who don't learn from history need to repeat it. Yeah. How would you say that applies in this situation, I guess?
Yeah, for those that didn't hear, he was saying there's an old statement, those who don't learn from the past are destined to repeat it. And so how does that really apply to this situation now? There's a way that we have told our stories. And as you apply that in this moment, there's a way that we have told them. We can continue to tell them the same way or realize that there really are more facts. There's more to the story. And so if we're going to change some things, we've got to, as we say, sort of move the lines and include the story, add some more chapters, or even go back. Most of you now, as you look in your textbooks and all that's there, you're reading stories, and then in some of those textbooks, you will see footnotes at the bottom of the page. And really what it says in there is these are the sources that we've checked. That's all it's really telling you. and this is where I got that information from. There's some people that they may not have talked to. There's some footnotes that are left out because they've never checked that. And now there's a wrestle to include more lines to the story, more sources that are checked, more people that are talked to who can bring it. And so it's a great question that you're asking, because if you all are going to help change the future, we need to hear more of the story. You need to hear more of the story. You need, whether you agree with it, don't agree with it, but give you a chance to even hear all of the story and everybody's perspective allows you to be able to make decisions and move the lines and invite more people in. That's a great question.
And if we're not out of time, I'd love to give a very specific illustration of exactly what Reverend Hamlin's talking about. So I mentioned renaming Lee Highway to Langston Boulevard. The first choice of the community group was actually, they wanted to name it Loving Boulevard. So is anybody familiar with the case of Loving versus Virginia? A few hands up. So this was the case that, the Supreme Court case that made it legal across the United States to marry somebody of a different race. This is a Supreme Court decision that is really meaningful to a lot of people in a community like Arlington. And people along then Lee Highway loved the idea of being able to really embody that sense of coming together, the idea of love, the idea of Virginia making history. But we checked the footnotes, right? We learned from the experience of naming things in the past being done without taking in the full perspective. We did some outreach to the descendants of Mildred and Richard Loving. I was in touch actually with one of their grandsons who felt really strongly that his grandparents were deeply private people who would not have appreciated having their name on a highway. They didn't particularly feel much connection to our part of Virginia, and they saw their decision and their marriage as a really private thing. They didn't want that for the future of Lee Highway, now Langston Boulevard. And so I think about that as that was trying to learn the lesson, trying to hear from, sometimes we even try to venerate people and we make them into stereotypes without hearing what their lived experience was actually like. So I'm not going to say we've got it perfect, but we are definitely trying to learn from history. I love that question.
So we're out of time for today. I think we're right at 10 o'clock. But before we leave, underneath in the center aisle, there are stacks of paper. If you're sitting in the center aisle, if you want to grab it and pass it down. So I'll just say 2 words and you can take these with you as you leave. Next time you're in the cathedral in the new year in December or January, if you head to the former Lee Jackson Bay,
let him get it.
Yeah. So, as you walk out, each of these pieces of papers has an outline of the South Arcade aisle windows, the former Lee Jackson Bay. We're putting in an augmented reality exhibit at the cathedral, and we're asking people to tell their stories. What story do you want told in the National Cathedral in a window? So you can take these with you. You can think about what stories you'd want to tell. You can create your stories on the piece of paper. You can come back to the cathedral. You all are there a lot. You can go to the bay, draw your story, download an app, and see it in the space. And think about what stories you want to tell in a place like the National Cathedral. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone, and thank you for coming.